Sometimes the loneliest moments happen in a room full of people. Eleanor Hartwell knew that feeling all too well as she stood at the Christmas basket auction in Silver Ridge, Montana, watching her basket sit unclaimed while the whole town looked away. Not one man would bid on the widow's basket. The silence cut deeper than any word ever could. Then Jacob Stone, the mountain man who lived alone in the hills, stepped forward and bought it for $20. What he found inside that basket changed everything. Eleanor had been hiding a secret, one that would shake the entire town and reveal a truth about her past that no one saw coming. Two broken people, one unexpected act of kindness, and a discovery that would give them both a second chance at life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind that swept down from the Bitterroot Mountains carried the sharp bite of December, cutting through the worn wool of Eleanor's coat as she made her way back from the general store. Silver Ridge stretched out before her, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the valley floor like a child clutching its mother's skirts. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals, and the sound of hammering echoed from the blacksmith's shop. It was 1883, and the town had grown from a mining camp to something resembling civilization, though Eleanor often wondered if civilized people were truly any kinder than those who'd first carved homes from this unforgiving land. She carried her purchases close. Flour, sugar, a precious tin of cinnamon she'd saved 2 months to afford. The Christmas basket auction was 3 days away, and she meant to make something worthy, something that might remind the good people of Silver Ridge that she was more than the widow they whispered about. More than the woman who'd lost everything and somehow still drew breath. 2 years. It had been 2 years since James Hartwell died in a hunting accident that never should have happened. 2 years since she'd heard his laugh, felt his calloused hand take hers, watched him wind his father's pocket watch each evening before bed. That watch sat on her mantel now, stopped at 4:30. The moment the men brought his body home on a makeshift stretcher, the moment her world ended. Eleanor's homestead sat a mile outside town, a deliberate distance James had chosen when they'd first arrived from Ohio. He'd wanted space, room to build something lasting. The cabin was solid, built with his own hands from lodgepole pine, with a stone chimney that drew clean and a root cellar deep enough to keep vegetables through the hottest winter. The barn was smaller than James had planned, but it housed her 2 aging horses, Cyrus and Belle, and the milk cow that kept her in butter and cheese to trade. She'd managed, barely. The garden had been adequate last summer, though she'd lost the squash to an early frost. The chickens still laid enough for her needs, but the fences needed mending, the barn roof wanted patching before the heavy snows came, and there was firewood to split. Always more firewood to split. Her hands, once soft and suited to needlework, had grown rough and capable. She could swing an axe now, could harness a horse, could do 100 things she'd never imagined doing when she'd married James at 19. What she couldn't do was change the way people looked at her. Sarah Miller had been the first to turn away, just 3 weeks after James died. Eleanor had walked into church, still wearing black, still hollow-eyed with grief, and Sarah had gathered her skirts and moved to a different pew. Others followed. Not everyone. There were still those who nodded, who offered tight smiles and empty words, but enough to make Eleanor feel the weight of their judgment like stones in her pockets. The talk started small. Why was she staying out there alone? A woman had no business running a homestead by herself. It wasn't proper. It wasn't safe. She should sell, move back east, live with family. When she didn't, the whispers grew teeth. She must have debts. She must be prideful. There was something not quite right about a woman who refused help, who insisted on managing alone. Then, 6 months after James died, little Sarah, her daughter, her sweet girl with James's blue eyes and her own dark curls, took sick with scarlet fever. Eleanor had done everything. She'd sponged her with cool water, forced chamomile tea between cracked lips, prayed until her voice gave out. Dr. Morrison came twice, said there was nothing more to do but wait and hope. Sarah died on a Tuesday morning, 3 days past her second birthday, small and still in Eleanor's arms. The town's judgment became a flood. They didn't say it to her face. Frontier people rarely did, but she heard it anyway. Grief had made her careless. She'd been too consumed with her own sorrow over James to properly care for a child. The house was too cold. She hadn't fed Sarah enough. She'd worked too hard and neglected what mattered most. Dr. Morrison told anyone who'd listen that scarlet fever took children from the wealthiest homes in the territory, that nothing Eleanor had done or failed to do made any difference. But people believe what they want to believe, and Silver Ridge wanted to believe that tragedy was earned, that loss came to those who deserved it. Because if it didn't, if death could take a good man and an innocent child for no reason at all, then none of them were safe. So Eleanor became the cautionary tale, the woman who'd been broken by her losses, the widow who lived alone and couldn't keep her own child alive. She'd nearly left a dozen times, had written letters to her sister in Cincinnati, had priced the sale of the homestead through the land office. But something kept her here. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the knowledge that James had loved this place, had believed in it, and leaving felt like abandoning him all over again. Or maybe it was simply that she had nowhere else to go, no other life to return to. The Christmas basket auction had been James's favorite tradition. Every year, the unmarried women and widows of Silver Ridge prepared elaborate meals packed in decorated baskets. The men bid on them, and the winning bidder shared the meal with the woman who'd prepared it. It was courtship dressed up as charity, a chance for matches to be made and for the community to raise money for the church. James had bid on Eleanor's basket their first year in town, outbidding Tom Crawford and making a show of it. And they'd shared fried chicken and apple pie while he told her about the homestead he meant to build. 3 months later, they were married. Last year, Eleanor hadn't participated. The grief was too fresh, the thought of facing the town too much to bear. But this year she'd decided to try, to show them she was still here, still part of Silver Ridge, still worthy of a place in their community. She'd spent weeks planning what to make, had saved every spare penny for the ingredients. She'd even bought new ribbon for the basket, cream-colored with tiny roses embroidered along the edge. Martha Calloway was the only woman in town who still spoke to Eleanor with any warmth. She ran the boarding house and had a way of looking past people's circumstances to see what lay beneath. She'd stopped by the homestead last week while Eleanor was hanging wash. "You're making a basket for the auction," Martha had said. "Not a question." "I am." "Eleanor." Martha's round face had been kind but troubled. "Are you certain that's wise?" "I have to try, Martha. I can't live like this forever, apart from everyone. Some of these people have hard hearts. I don't want to see you hurt worse than you already have been." Eleanor had looked at the sheets flapping in the wind, at the mountains rising sharp and indifferent beyond her fence line. "I'm already hurt. What's a little more?" Now, walking back from the general store with her precious supplies, Eleanor let herself imagine it going well. She imagined her basket drawing bids, imagined sharing a meal with someone kind, imagined a conversation that didn't die in awkward silence. She imagined belonging again. The pocket watch was in her coat pocket. She carried it sometimes, a talisman against loneliness. Tonight she'd wind it, listen to its steady tick, and begin preparing the meal that might, just might, change everything. She didn't let herself imagine the alternative, didn't let herself think about standing in front of the whole town while no one bid, while the silence stretched and stretched until it broke her. But deep down, in the place where grief lived alongside hope, she knew it was possible, knew the town might deliver one more cruelty, one more reminder that she didn't belong. 3 days. She had 3 days to prepare. and then she'd know. The town hall had been transformed. Pine garlands draped from the rafters, their sharp scent mixing with wood smoke and the perfume of too many bodies pressed into one space. Candles flickered on every available surface, casting warm light that softened the rough-hewn walls and made the frosted windows glow like amber. Children chased each other between the adults, their laughter high and bright, while the men gathered in clusters near the makeshift bar where Thomas Brennan was pouring whiskey with a generous hand. Eleanor stood near the back wall, her basket clutched in both hands. She'd wrapped it in a cream-colored cloth and tied it with a ribbon she'd bought, and inside was everything she'd promised herself. Fried chicken that she'd cooked that morning, the pieces golden and still faintly warm. Buttermilk biscuits with honey butter. Green beans she'd put up in August. Apple cake made with the last of her preserved fruit and that precious tin of cinnamon. And tucked beneath the cloth napkins, hidden where only the winner would see, were the other things. The things that mattered more than food. She shouldn't have come. The thought had struck her a dozen times on the ride into town, Belle pulling the small wagon through snow that had started falling just after dawn. She could turn around now, take her basket home, save herself whatever was coming. But she'd made a promise to herself. She would try. She would stand here and let the town decide once and for all whether there was any place for her in Silver Ridge. The other women were already there, their baskets arranged on a long table at the front of the hall. Lucy Patterson's was decorated with holly and red ribbon, elaborate as a wedding cake. Sarah Miller had covered hers in blue gingham with white lace. Even young Emma Thornton, barely 18, had managed something lovely. A woven basket with dried flowers worked into the handle. Eleanor's looked plain by comparison, simple and honest, like her. She added it to the table and stepped back quickly before anyone could comment, before anyone could look at her with that mixture of pity and disdain she'd come to know so well. Eleanor. Martha appeared at her elbow, solid and reassuring, in a dress of deep green wool. You came. I said I would. That basket looks beautiful, and I'd wager what's inside is better than anything else here. Eleanor managed a small smile. You haven't tasted Lucy Patterson's cooking. I have, and I stand by what I said. Martha squeezed her arm. Be brave, dear. You belong here just as much as anyone. Pastor Edmund Yates took his position at the front of the hall, and the noise began to settle. He was a tall man gone thick around the middle, with a voice that could fill a room without effort. He raised his hands, and the crowd quieted. Friends, neighbors, welcome to our 10th annual Christmas basket auction. His voice rolled out warm and practiced. As always, the proceeds will go to support our church and help those in need throughout the coming year. Now, gentlemen, you know the rules. Each basket will be auctioned to the highest bidder, and you'll share that fine meal with the lady who prepared it. Let's make this a generous evening, shall we? The auction began. Lucy Patterson's basket went first, and the bidding was spirited. Tom Crawford and James Sullivan drove the price up between them, back and forth like a game, until Tom finally won at $8. Lucy preened, and Tom looked pleased with himself. They'd been courting for months. Everyone knew this was simply making it official. Sarah Miller's basket went for $6 to Robert Chen, the assayer's son. Emma Thornton's drew enthusiastic bids from 3 young men and finally sold for $7 to Peter Daniels, who turned red as summer berries when Emma smiled at him. One by one, the baskets found buyers. The prices ranged from $4 to $9, and each transaction was accompanied by applause and good-natured ribbing. The hall was warm with whiskey and Christmas spirit, with the particular satisfaction that came from tradition observed and expectations met. Then Pastor Yates lifted Eleanor's basket. The change was immediate. The warmth in the room didn't disappear. The candles still flickered, the fire still crackled in the pot-bellied stove. But something else shifted. A coolness, a drawing back like water pulling away from shore before a wave. "And here we have a basket from Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell," Pastor Yates said, his voice still hearty but with an edge of uncertainty now. "I'm sure there's a fine meal waiting here. Shall we start the bidding at $2? Silence. Eleanor felt it like a physical thing, that silence. It pressed against her chest, squeezed her throat, made her hands shake where she'd folded them in front of her. She kept her eyes forward, kept her chin up, even as heat flooded her face. "Come now, gentlemen," Pastor Yates tried again. $2 to start. Surely someone—" Nothing. Men looked at their boots, at the ceiling, at their neighbors. Some of the women watched Eleanor with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to something darker. Lucy Patterson whispered something to Sarah Miller, and they both looked away quickly when Eleanor's gaze swept past them. $1 then. The pastor's voice had lost its warmth. He sounded almost angry now, though Eleanor couldn't tell if the anger was directed at the crowd or at her for putting him in this position. $1 for a fine basket and the company of Mrs. Hartwell. The silence stretched. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run, wanted to snatch the basket from the pastor's hands and flee into the night, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. This was worse than she'd imagined. Worse than anything. To stand here while the entire town refused even a single dollar, while they made clear in the cruelest way possible that she was worth nothing, deserved nothing, belonged nowhere. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry. Not here, not in front of these people who had already taken so much from her. 50 cents, Pastor Yates said, and now his voice was quiet, almost pleading. Surely, $20. The voice came from the back of the hall near the door, deep and rough like gravel tumbling in a stream. Every head turned. The man standing there was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin and wool that spoke of mountains and solitude. His hair was dark and shaggy, touching his collar, and a beard covered the lower half of his face. His eyes were clear and steady and fixed on Eleanor's basket. Jacob Stone. Eleanor knew him by reputation only. The mountain man who came to town twice a year for supplies, who traded furs and kept to himself, who lived somewhere up in the high country where winters could kill and usually did. She'd seen him perhaps 3 times in 2 years, always at a distance. The town spoke of him rarely, and when they did it was with a mixture of respect and wariness. He was outside their circle, separate, and that separation made him either dangerous or irrelevant depending on who was speaking. He walked forward now, his boots heavy on the plank floor. The crowd parted for him instinctively. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and counted out coins onto the table beside Pastor Yates. 20 silver dollars that clinked and shone in the candlelight. $20 for the lady's basket, he said. His voice was quiet now, meant only for the pastor, but in the silence it carried. If she'll share it with me. Pastor Yates looked stunned. He glanced at Eleanor, then back at Jacob Stone, then at the money. Yes. Of course. Mrs. Hartwell. Eleanor couldn't speak. Her throat had closed completely. She managed a nod. Jacob picked up the basket as carefully as if it held something precious and fragile. He looked at Eleanor for the first time, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Not pity, not judgment, something else entirely. "There's a table in the corner," he said. "If that suits you, ma'am." Eleanor found her voice. It came out smaller than she wanted, but it came. "Yes, that would be fine." The crowd watched in silence as Jacob Stone carried her basket to a small table near the back of the hall, set it down carefully, and pulled out a chair. Waited for her to sit before taking his own seat. And Eleanor, her heart still racing, her hands still shaking, walked through that silence with her head high, and sat across from the mountain man who had just paid more for her basket than anyone had paid all evening. Behind them the auction continued, but Eleanor didn't hear it. All she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears and the quiet sound of Jacob Stone untying the ribbon on her basket, his rough hands gentle with the cream-colored cloth she'd chosen so carefully. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "No need for thanks, Ma'am. Not for doing what's right." And Eleanor, who had been alone for so long, who had faced so much judgment and cruelty, felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, opening, like ice giving way to spring. The week before Christmas arrived with a cold snap that turned breath to ice and made the ground ring like iron under boot heels. Jacob came 3 times that week, each visit lasting longer than the last. He mended the fence along the north pasture, split enough wood to see Eleanor through January, and fixed the loose boards on her porch that she'd been meaning to address for months. They fell into an easy rhythm. Eleanor would have coffee ready when he arrived, and at midday she'd bring out whatever meal she'd prepared. They'd sit on the porch or at her kitchen table, and they'd talk. Not about anything important at first. Just the weather, the price of supplies in town, the deer Jacob had seen on his ride down from the mountains. But gradually, as trust built like slow-growing ice on a pond, their conversations deepened. She learned that he'd been a carpenter in St. Louis before heading west, that he and Margaret had been childhood friends who'd married young, that he'd built their house with his own hands, and after she died, he couldn't bear to stay in it, couldn't bear the emptiness that echoed in every room. He learned that she and James had come from Ohio seeking land and opportunity, that Sarah had been born in the cabin's bedroom during a spring snowstorm, and that Eleanor had never been so frightened or so happy as in those hours, that she still wound James's pocket watch every evening, even though it no longer kept time, because the ritual connected her to him. On the 4th day, Pastor Yates appeared in his buggy while Jacob was replacing a rotted beam in the barn. Eleanor saw him coming and felt her stomach knot. The pastor rarely made social calls, and when he did, they usually came with expectations. "Mrs. Hartwell." He climbed down heavily, his breath clouding. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, Pastor." She led him to the porch, offered coffee he declined. "I'll be direct, as that seems kindest." He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "There's been talk in town about Mr. Stone's frequent visits here." Eleanor felt heat rise to her face. "He's been helping with repairs. The work is too much for me alone." "I understand that, and I commend Christian charity. But you must see how it looks. A widow and an unmarried man, spending so much time together without proper supervision. It raises questions of propriety." "Questions from whom?" Eleanor heard the edge in her own voice and didn't try to soften it. "From Sarah Miller, from Lucy Patterson, the same women who wouldn't bid a penny for my basket?" Pastor Yates flushed. "The circumstances of that evening were unfortunate, I agree. But Eleanor," he used her first name, a familiarity that felt presumptuous, "you must think of your reputation, whatever's left of it." The words landed like a slap. Eleanor stood, her hands clenched at her sides. "My reputation. I see. And what would you have me do, Pastor? Turn away the only person who's shown me genuine kindness? Refuse help I desperately need? Or perhaps you're volunteering to come mend my fences and split my wood? That's not what I've tried to live according to what this town expects. I've been quiet and proper and grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance anyone threw my way. And it's brought me nothing but judgment and isolation." Her voice was shaking now. "Jacob Stone has shown me more Christian charity in a week than this entire town has in 2 years. If that damages my reputation further, so be it." The pastor looked genuinely taken aback. Behind him, Jacob had emerged from the barn, his hammer still in hand. He stood watching, not interfering, but present. "Ready." "I came here to help," Pastor Yates said stiffly, "to guide you away from choices you might regret. I appreciate your concern, but I'm capable of making my own choices." After the pastor left, his buggy rattling back toward town, Eleanor sat on the porch steps and put her face in her hands. She wasn't crying, was too angry to cry, but her whole body trembled with the force of what she'd said. She'd never spoken to anyone like that. Not in her entire life. Jacob sat down beside her, close but not touching. That took courage. That was foolish. He'll tell everyone. They'll think... She stopped, unable to say what they'd think. They already think it, Eleanor. People see what they want to see. He was quiet for a moment. But if my being here is making your life harder, I can stop coming. No. The word came out fierce, almost violent. No, you're the only thing making my life bearable. She hadn't meant to say it. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Jacob looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. I should tell you something, he said finally. I didn't buy your basket out of charity. Eleanor's breath caught. What do you mean? I've seen you in town, not often, but enough. Seen the way you carry yourself, proud, even when people look through you. Seen the way you keep going when most would have quit. He turned to face her fully. I bought your basket because I wanted to know you, because I thought... He paused, searching for words. Because I thought maybe we could understand each other. We're both broken, Eleanor said quietly. We're both still standing. He reached out, slowly enough that she could pull away, and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm. That's not the same as broken. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. She should pull away. Should maintain propriety. Should think of her reputation. Should remember that she'd loved James and buried Sarah and had no right to feel what she was beginning to feel. But his hand was steady in hers, and she was so tired of being alone. What are we doing, Jacob? I don't know. He said it honestly, without pretense. But I know I look forward to these days. Know I think about you when I'm up in the mountains. Know that for the first time in 5 years, I'm not sure I want to spend the rest of my life alone. Eleanor's eyes burned. I'm afraid. So am I. He squeezed her hand gently. But I'm more afraid of walking away, of going back to the mountains and wondering what might have happened if I'd stayed. They sat like that as the sun moved across the sky and the mountains cast long shadows over her land, holding hands like young people courting, though they were both past youth and past innocence. Two people who'd lost everything and somehow found each other in the ruins. That evening, Jacob brought in an armload of the wood he'd split and built up her fire until the cabin glowed with warmth. He didn't stay for supper, wouldn't for propriety's sake, even though Eleanor wanted to ask him. But before he left, he stood in her doorway and looked at her with an expression that made her heart race. I'm falling in love with you, Eleanor, he said quietly. I thought you should know that. Thought it was only fair to tell you before we go any further down this road. Eleanor couldn't speak. Could only stand there with tears on her face while he touched her cheek gently with one rough fingertip. You don't have to say anything. Not now. Just think about it. Think about whether you might want the same thing. He left before she could respond, and Eleanor stood in the warmth of her cabin, the cabin she'd shared with James, where she'd given birth to Sarah, where she'd survived 2 years of grinding loneliness and let herself imagine something she'd thought impossible. A future, with Jacob. A life built not from the ashes of what they'd lost, but from something new. Something theirs. The pocket watch sat on the mantel, stopped at 4:30. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment, then very deliberately wound it, set it to the correct time. Let it tick steadily in the quiet room. Some things ended, but others were just beginning. Christmas week arrived with clear skies and temperatures that dropped so low the trees cracked in the night like rifle shots. Eleanor woke each morning to frost patterns on her windows that looked like ferns, like feathers, like the delicate work of some winter artist. She'd stand at the window with her coffee and watch the sun rise over the mountains and think about Jacob's words. "I'm falling in love with you." She should have been terrified, should have felt guilt. James had only been gone 2 years, and Sarah, but when she searched her heart for those feelings, she found something else instead: permission. As though James himself was telling her it was all right to live again, to love again, to stop measuring her life by what she'd lost. Jacob came on Christmas Eve morning. Eleanor had been baking since dawn. Bread, pies, the last of her preserves put up in neat jars. She'd told herself she was preparing for the holiday, but she knew the truth. She was preparing for him. He brought firewood and a burlap sack that clinked when he set it down. "What's this?" she asked. "Christmas dinner, if you'll have me." He opened the sack to reveal potatoes, carrots, a bottle of wine that must have cost him dearly, and wrapped in cloth, a Christmas goose he'd traded for in town. Eleanor felt tears threaten. "Jacob, this is too much." "It's not near enough." He set the items on her table carefully. "I thought, if you're not otherwise engaged, we might share the day tomorrow, properly, like people courting." "People courting," Eleanor repeated. The words felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. "If that's presumptuous, I apologize. But after what I said, after what I've been feeling, it seemed dishonest to pretend otherwise." Eleanor looked at him, standing in her kitchen, this mountain man who'd defended her honor and mended her fences and told her he was falling in love with her. She thought about the town's judgment, about propriety, about all the reasons she should send him away. And then she thought about the alternative, spending Christmas alone again, spending every day alone for the rest of her life. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said. The words came out quiet, but steady. "I've been trying not to, trying to be sensible and proper and all the things a widow should be. But I can't help it, Jacob. When you're here, I feel alive again. When you leave, the house feels empty in a way it never did before." He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. Not roughly, not presumptively, but with a tenderness that made her breath catch. She pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart beating steady and strong, felt his arms solid around her, and thought this is what home feels like. "Come to the Christmas service with me tonight," she said against his coat. "Let the whole town see. I don't care anymore what they think." "Are you certain?" She pulled back enough to look up at him. "I'm certain that I want to walk into that church with you beside me. I'm certain that I'm tired of hiding what I feel, and I'm certain—" her voice broke slightly. "I'm certain that life is too short and too hard to turn away from something good." That evening, as the sun set and the church bells rang out over Silver Ridge, Eleanor and Jacob rode into town together. She sat beside him on his horse, bundled in her best coat, and she felt every eye turn toward them as they passed. Let them look, let them talk. She'd spent 2 years trying to earn their approval, and it had gained her nothing. Perhaps it was time to stop trying. The church was warm and bright with candles, pine boughs draped over every surface, and the smell of wood smoke and melting wax. Pastor Yates stood at the door greeting parishioners, and his face went carefully neutral when he saw them approach. "Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Stone." "Merry Christmas, Pastor," Eleanor said, and walked past him with her head high. They found seats near the back. People stared, whispered, turned away and turned back. Sarah Miller's face was pinched with disapproval. Lucy Patterson looked scandalized. But Martha Calloway, dear Martha, caught Eleanor's eye from across the aisle and smiled. Actually smiled, warm and approving. The service began. They sang the old hymns, listened to the Christmas story read in Pastor Yates' rolling voice, stood for prayers, and sat for reflection. And through it all, Jacob's presence beside her was steady and sure. His shoulder touched hers. Once, during a prayer, he found her hand and held it. Afterward, as people filed out into the cold night air, Martha approached them. "Eleanor," she said warmly. "Mr. Stone, Merry Christmas to you both." "Merry Christmas, Martha." Martha leaned in close, her voice dropping. "There's some who'll judge you, but there's others, more than you might think, who are glad to see you finding happiness again. You deserve it, dear. Both of you do." She pressed something into Eleanor's hand, a small package wrapped in cloth. "For tomorrow, a little something for your Christmas dinner." Before Eleanor could thank her, Martha had moved away, greeting others, but the warmth of her words remained. Jacob's hand found Eleanor's back, gentle and protective. "Ready to face the gauntlet?" he asked quietly. "With you?" "Yes." They walked through the crowd together, through the whispers and the stares, through the disapproval and the curiosity. Some people nodded. Others turned away. Pastor Yates looked troubled, but said nothing. And Eleanor found that she didn't care, not anymore. She'd stood alone against their judgment for too long. Now she had Jacob, and that made all the difference. They rode back to her homestead through snow that had begun falling, soft and silent. The world was white and still, peaceful in a way that felt sacred. Jacob helped her down from the horse and stood close, his hands on her waist. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight, for standing with me. Thank you for giving me something to stand for." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, a question and a promise both. Eleanor kissed him back, tasting snow and cold and something sweeter. Hope, the possibility of joy after sorrow, love after loss. Tomorrow they'd share Christmas dinner. Tomorrow they'd take another step forward on this unexpected path. But tonight it was enough to stand in the falling snow with his arms around her and know she wasn't alone anymore. The mountains rose dark against the starlit sky. The cabin's windows glowed warm behind them, and Eleanor thought of James and Sarah, thought of the life she'd lost, and sent them a silent message of love and goodbye and thank you. They'd always be with her, but it was time to live again. Time to let herself be happy. Christmas morning dawned cold and brilliant. Eleanor woke early, as she always did, but this time anticipation pulled her from sleep rather than habit. Jacob would arrive by mid-morning. They'd prepare the goose together, share a meal, spend the day as people courting, no, as people in love, were meant to spend it. She dressed carefully in her blue wool dress, the one she'd worn to marry James. It felt right somehow, to honor the past while stepping into the future. She braided her hair and pinned it up, studied her reflection in the small mirror. The face looking back at her seemed younger than it had in months. Hope did that, she supposed. Made you look alive again. The morning passed in a pleasant blur of preparation. She peeled potatoes and carrots, set the table with her best dishes, built up the fire until the cabin glowed with warmth. And all the while, she felt something building inside her chest. Not just happiness, though there was that. Something else. A pressure, a need to speak, to tell the truth. Because there was still one thing Jacob didn't know, one secret she'd kept, too afraid to reveal it, too uncertain of his reaction. He arrived at 10, his arms full of pine boughs and his face bright with cold. "Merry Christmas," he said, and kissed her. A real kiss this time, not careful or questioning, but full of certainty and warmth. "Merry Christmas." She helped him arrange the pine boughs around the cabin, their sharp scent mixing with the smell of roasting goose. They worked together easily, passing items back and forth, moving around each other with a familiarity that felt both new and ancient. But Eleanor's hands were shaking, her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to tell him. Had to, before they went any further, before he committed himself to her fully. It wasn't fair to keep it hidden, wasn't right. But fear squeezed her throat closed every time she tried to form the words. They ate at noon, the goose perfectly done, the vegetables tender, Martha's gift revealed as a jar of brandied cherries that complemented the meal beautifully. Jacob praised every dish, told stories about Christmases past, made her laugh with descriptions of his failed attempts at cooking in the mountains. The wine loosened something in Eleanor's chest, warmed her from the inside out. After dinner, they sat by the fire. Jacob had brought his tools in from the cold, and he began working on a piece of wood he'd pulled from his pack, carving something, though Eleanor couldn't yet see what. "Jacob," she said. Her voice came out thin, uncertain. "There's something I need to tell you." His hands stilled. He looked up, his grey eyes serious. "All right." Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady. She crossed to her bedroom, the room she'd shared with James, where Sarah had been born, and opened the chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were the things she'd kept hidden, the things that mattered most. Baby clothes, tiny and carefully folded. A small blanket Eleanor had knitted. Sarah's christening gown. And at the bottom, wrapped in linen, a pair of child's shoes that had never been worn. She carried them back to the main room, her heart racing so fast she thought she might faint. Jacob had set down his carving. He watched her approach, his expression careful, open, waiting. "These were Sarah's," Eleanor said, setting the items on the table between them. Her voice shook. "Some of them she wore, others—" She touched the unworn shoes. She never got the chance. "Eleanor, please, let me finish." She took a breath that felt like drowning. "I put some of these in the basket you bought at the auction, the hand-carved spoon, Sarah's drawing, but I put other things too. Baby clothes I'd made, a blanket." She met his eyes, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "I put them there because I was pregnant." The word hung in the air between them. Jacob's face went very still. "I found out 3 days before the auction. I'd suspected for weeks, but I was afraid to hope, afraid to believe." Her voice broke. She pressed her hands flat against the table to stop them shaking. "James died 2 years ago, but Sarah died only 6 months after him. And I blamed myself. The town blamed me. They said I was too consumed with grief to care for her properly, that I'd neglected her. Eleanor, you told me it was scarlet fever." It was. Dr. Morrison confirmed it. But that didn't matter to them. They needed someone to blame, and I am an easy target. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. "When I realized I was pregnant again, I was terrified. Terrified the town would find out. Terrified they'd say I was unfit to raise another child. Terrified they'd try to take this baby from me before it was even born." Jacob stood slowly. "How far along?" 4 months, nearly 5 now. She placed a hand on her stomach, where beneath her dress and her carefully chosen layers, a small swell had begun. "I've been hiding it, wearing loose clothes, staying away from town as much as possible. But it won't be long before everyone knows. And when they do, they'll judge you," Jacob finished quietly. "They'll say terrible things. They'll try to interfere." "Yes." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "And I thought, I needed you to know, before you decided whether you want to be part of this. Because if you stay, if you love me, you'll be tied to that judgment too. You'll be defending not just me, but this child. A child that isn't yours. A child that will remind everyone that I was James's wife, that I had a life before you." The silence that followed felt eternal. Jacob stood perfectly still, his face unreadable, and Eleanor felt her heart shatter. She'd known this might happen, had known that telling him the truth might drive him away, but she'd had to try, had to be honest, even if honesty cost her everything. Then Jacob crossed to the chest and knelt beside it. He picked up one of the tiny gowns, held it gently in his rough hands. "When Margaret died," he said quietly, not looking at Eleanor. "She was 6 months along. We'd already chosen a name. Thomas, after her father. I'd started building a cradle, had it half finished when the accident happened. He set the gown down carefully. I burned it. The cradle. Couldn't bear to look at it. Couldn't stand the reminder of what I'd lost. And I told myself I'd never want children again. Never want a family. It hurt too much. He stood and turned to face her. His eyes were wet. But these past weeks, being with you, helping you, falling in love with you. He shook his head. I felt something I thought was dead. Hope. The possibility that maybe I could have that life after all. Maybe I could be a father, a husband, part of something bigger than just my own pain. Eleanor couldn't breathe. Jacob. He crossed to her in 3 strides and took her face in his hands. Eleanor Hartwell, I don't care that this child isn't mine by blood. I don't care what the town thinks or says or does. If you'll have me, if you'll trust me, I want to be this baby's father. I want to marry you. I want us to be a family. You can't mean that. I've never meant anything more. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her trembling lips. Marry me. Soon. Before this baby comes. Let me give you and this child my name, my protection. Let me love you both the way you deserve to be loved. Eleanor broke then, sobbing against his chest while he held her tight. All the fear, all the secrets, all the desperate hope she'd been carrying alone, it poured out of her in great wrenching gasps. And Jacob held her through it all, his arms steady and sure, his voice murmuring comfort against her hair. We'll face them together, he said. The whole damn town if we have to. We'll protect this child together. We'll build a life together. You're not alone anymore, Eleanor. You'll never be alone again. When she could finally speak, Eleanor pulled back enough to look at him. Are you certain? Are you absolutely certain? I've been alone in those mountains for 5 years, Jacob said. 5 years of silence and solitude and telling myself it was enough. And then I walked into that town hall and saw you standing there, humiliated and brave and refusing to break. And something in me recognized something in you. We're survivors, Eleanor. We've both lost everything. But maybe we can build something new together. Something that honors what we lost but doesn't let it define us. Eleanor thought of James, of how he'd loved her, of how he'd wanted children. Lots of them, filling the cabin with laughter and noise. She thought of Sarah, her sweet girl, who'd never had the chance to grow up. And she thought of this new life inside her, this unexpected gift that had terrified and sustained her through the darkest months. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. God help us both, yes. Jacob laughed, actually laughed, bright and full of joy, and spun her around the cabin. When he set her down, he was grinning like a boy. Then we'll do it soon, this week, before anyone can interfere or object or make things harder than they need to be. He cupped her face gently. We'll protect this baby, Eleanor. Together. I promise you that. That evening, as the sun set on Christmas Day and the fire burned low, Jacob showed Eleanor what he'd been carving. A cradle, small and perfect, the wood smooth and lovingly shaped. He'd been working on it for weeks, he admitted. Had hoped, even before she told him, that they might have a future that included children. Eleanor traced the careful detail with her fingertips and wept again. But these were different tears. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of overwhelming love for this man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she'd been too afraid to speak. They made plans. They'd marry within the week before the new year. They'd face the town together, and when the baby came in the spring, it would have a father and a mother and a home filled with love. The secret was out, the truth revealed, and instead of destroying everything, it had brought them closer than ever. The day after Christmas, Jacob rode back into the mountains to gather his belongings. He'd lived up there for 5 years, had built a small cabin and established a life of careful solitude, and now he was leaving it behind. Eleanor watched him go with her hand on her stomach and hope burning bright in her chest. He'd be gone 3 days, he said. 3 days to pack what mattered and close that chapter of his life. Then he'd come back, and they'd marry and face whatever came next together. But 3 days felt like an eternity when you were waiting for your whole life to change. Eleanor spent the time preparing. She aired out the cabin, washed every surface, made it ready for Jacob's permanent presence. She took stock of supplies, made lists of what they'd need for winter and for the baby. She sewed, tiny gowns and blankets, her hands working automatically while her mind raced ahead to spring, to birth, to holding a living child in her arms again. And she worried that Jacob would change his mind once he was away from her, once the immediacy of their connection faded. Worried about the town's reaction when they announced their engagement. Worried about the baby, about whether she could keep this one safe when she'd failed Sarah so completely. On the second day, Martha arrived with a basket of food and a determined expression. "I heard through the usual channels," she said, setting the basket on Eleanor's table. "You and Jacob Stone are planning to marry." Eleanor's defenses rose immediately. News travels fast. In a town this size, it travels faster than a brush fire. Martha pulled out a chair and sat without being invited. "Now, before you tell me it's none of my business, let me say what I came to say." Eleanor waited, braced for judgment. "I think it's wonderful," Martha said simply. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon, and you look at him like he's the answer to a prayer. After what you've been through, after what he's been through, you both deserve happiness." Eleanor felt tears threaten. Again. She seemed to cry at everything these days. The town won't see it that way. Some won't, but some will. Martha leaned forward. "Eleanor, I've lived in Silver Ridge for 20 years. I've seen people come and go, seen reputations rise and fall, seen judgment dispensed and forgiveness granted. And I've learned that the people worth worrying about are the ones who can see past their own prejudices to the truth underneath." "And what truth is that?" "That you're a good woman who's had terrible luck. That Jacob Stone is a good man who's been healing in solitude. That together you might make something beautiful." Martha paused. "And that there's a baby coming who'll need all the love and protection you both can give." Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her stomach. "You know. I suspected at the auction, the way you held yourself, the fullness in your face, and I've seen enough pregnancies to recognize the signs." Martha's expression softened. "How far along?" 5 months next week. And the town, they'll figure it out soon if they haven't already." "I know." Eleanor's voice was small. "They'll say terrible things. They'll say I'm unfit, that I killed Sarah through neglect, that I don't deserve another child. Let them say what they will. You'll have Jacob beside you, and me, and others, more than you think." Martha reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. "There's a group of women in this town who've lost children, who know the particular pain of that loss, who understand that scarlet fever doesn't discriminate, doesn't care how good a mother you are. We don't speak up often enough, but we're there. And when your time comes, we'll stand with you." Eleanor gripped Martha's hand like a lifeline. "Why are you being so kind to me?" "Because someone should have been kind to you 2 years ago, and we weren't. Because I lost a daughter to diphtheria when she was 4, and I remember how people looked at me afterward, like I was cursed, like grief was contagious." Martha's eyes were wet. "Because kindness costs nothing, and its absence costs everything." They sat together for a long time, 2 women who'd survived loss and found strength in its aftermath. Martha told her about the daughter she'd lost, about the son who'd moved east and rarely wrote, about the loneliness of running a boarding house filled with temporary residents who never became family. Eleanor told her about the pregnancy, about her fears and hopes, about the way Jacob had responded when she told him the truth. When Martha finally left, she pressed something into Eleanor's hand, a small wooden cross worn smooth with age. "This was my daughter's. I'd like you to have it for the baby, for protection and love and all the things we hope for our children. Eleanor closed her fingers around it and wept. Jacob returned on the third day, his horse laden with packs. He'd brought everything he owned. Tools, clothes, furs he meant to trade, and carefully wrapped in oilcloth, the beginnings of furniture he'd started building in the mountains. A chair, a small table, the half-finished cradle he'd been carving. "I'm home," he said, and the words settled over Eleanor like a blessing. Home. He called her homestead home, called her life his life, and the miracle of it threatened to overwhelm her. They spent the evening planning. They'd marry in 2 days, on the last day of December. Pastor Yates had agreed, though reluctantly, after Jacob had a private conversation with him that Eleanor suspected involved more than gentle persuasion. They'd keep it small, just Martha and the pastor's wife as witnesses. No announcement, no celebration, just a quiet commitment before God and the law. "After we're married," Jacob said, "we'll tell people. We'll go into town together, present ourselves as husband and wife, and let them adjust to the reality. They'll be furious. They'll say we rushed it. Let them say it. By the time they're done saying it, it'll be true, and there won't be anything they can do." He pulled her close. "And when the baby comes, it'll have my name. Our name. No one can question its legitimacy or your fitness as a mother. I'll be standing right there, claiming this child as mine." Eleanor rested her head against his chest. "You'd do that? Claim another man's child as your own?" "This baby is yours, Eleanor. That makes it mine. Blood doesn't make a father. Love does. Commitment does. Being there through the hard parts does." His voice was fierce. "I didn't get to be a father to my son. Thomas died with Margaret, and I never got to hold him, never got to tell him I loved him. This baby, your baby, I can be a father to. If you'll let me." "I'll let you." Eleanor's voice broke. "God, Jacob, I'll let you." They made love that night for the first time, tender and careful and full of promise. Afterward, lying in the bed she'd shared with James, Eleanor felt a moment of guilt, sharp and painful, that faded into something else. Gratitude. James had loved her, had given her good years and a beautiful daughter, but James was gone, and Jacob was here, warm and solid beside her, his hand protective over her swelling belly, his breath even in sleep. She could honor the past and embrace the future. They weren't in conflict. They were both part of who she was becoming. The next day, they prepared the cabin for the EIE ceremony. Jacob cut pine boughs and arranged them around the main room, filling the space with evergreen scent. Eleanor baked bread and made a simple meal for after. She took out her wedding dress, the same blue wool she'd worn to marry James, and wondered if it was wrong to wear it again. "It's right," Jacob said when she asked him. "You're not pretending the past didn't happen. You're bringing it with you into our future. That's honest. That's real." Evening came. Martha arrived early, bringing a small bouquet of dried flowers she'd saved from summer. The pastor's wife, Jane, came with her, a quiet woman who'd always been kind to Eleanor in small, unobtrusive ways. They helped Eleanor dress, pinned her hair with careful attention, stood back and pronounced her beautiful. "You're radiant," Martha said. "Truly." Eleanor looked at herself in the small mirror. She didn't look radiant. She looked tired and scared and hopeful all at once. But there was color in her cheeks and light in her eyes and beneath her dress, hidden but present, a child growing strong and healthy. "I'm ready," she said. Jacob was waiting in the main room, dressed in clothes Eleanor had helped him buy in town, a proper shirt and vest, boots that weren't worn to nothing. He'd trimmed his beard, combed his hair, and when he saw her, his expression transformed. Pure love, pure joy, pure certainty. Pastor Yates stood before the fire, his Bible open. He looked uncomfortable but determined to see this through. He cleared his throat. We're here today. Wait. Eleanor held up a hand. She crossed to the mantel and picked up James's pocket watch. She'd wound it every evening since setting it running again, had kept it ticking steadily like a heartbeat in the cabin. Now she looked at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, feeling the weight of all it represented. Then she placed it carefully in a drawer, not throwing it away, not abandoning it, just putting it to rest, honoring what it had been while making space for what was coming. "All right," she said, turning back to Jacob. "I'm ready now." Pastor Yates began again. The familiar words of the marriage ceremony, the promises and commitments, the sacred vows that bound two lives together. Eleanor listened to her own voice speaking, heard Jacob's steady responses, felt Martha's hand squeezing hers in support. "By the power vested in me," Pastor Yates said finally, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Jacob kissed her, while Martha cried happy tears and Jane smiled, and the fire crackled warm in the hearth. And Eleanor thought, this is my wedding day, again. Different, but the same. Ending and beginning all at once. They were married on the last day of 1883. As the old year died and the new one waited to be born, Eleanor Hartwell became Eleanor Stone. A new name, a new life, a new chance at happiness. Tomorrow they'd face the town. Tomorrow the real battle would begin. But tonight they were simply two people in love, married before God and friends, starting their life together in a cabin that had seen so much sorrow and was finally ready to hold joy again. They stood on the church steps as the congregation filtered out around them. Jacob kept Eleanor close, his arm around her waist, a clear statement of protection and commitment. Some people nodded as they passed. Others averted their eyes. Sarah Miller and Lucy Patterson swept by with their heads high, radiating disapproval. But Martha lingered, as did Jane Yates and Emma Thornton. A few other women gathered, women Eleanor recognized but had never spoken to at length, women who'd lost children, who'd faced their own struggles, who understood suffering in a way the fortunate never could. "Eleanor," Martha said quietly, "whatever you need to say, we're listening." Eleanor looked at Jacob. He squeezed her hand, giving her strength. She took a breath that felt like drowning and stepped forward. "I'm pregnant," she said. The words dropped into the cold morning air like stones into still water. 5 months. The baby is James's, my late husband's. I didn't know I was carrying when he died. Didn't know until 3 months ago. The women's faces registered shock, then understanding, then, in some cases, something that looked like sympathy, but behind them, Eleanor could see others who'd lingered, could hear the sharp intake of breath, the renewed whispers. "I've been hiding it," Eleanor continued, her voice shaking now, but determined. "Wearing loose clothes, staying away from town, because I was terrified, after Sarah died, after the way people talked, after the judgment." Her voice broke. "I was terrified they'd say I was unfit, that they'd try to take this baby away before it was even born." "That's why you married so quickly," Jane Yates said softly. "Not accusing, understanding, partly. But also because I love Jacob, because he knew about the baby when he proposed, because he wants to be this child's father, wants to give it his name and his protection." Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks. "I'm not asking for approval. I'm not even asking for acceptance. I'm just asking—" She struggled for the words. "I'm just asking to be left alone to raise my child in peace." Sarah Miller's voice cut through the morning air. She'd returned, drawn by the commotion. "You see, this is exactly what I said. She trapped him, got herself pregnant and trapped the first man foolish enough to show her kindness." Jacob moved before Eleanor could stop him. He stepped toward Sarah, his face dark with anger. "That's enough." "Is it? Everyone's thinking it. She's using you, Mr. Stone, using you to legitimize her shame." The only shame here, Jacob said, his voice low and dangerous, is yours. Eleanor told me about the baby before I proposed. I knew I chose this. I chose her, and I chose this child, and if you say one more word against my wife, so help me. Jacob. Eleanor's voice stopped him. She moved to his side, placed her hand on his arm. Don't. She's not worth it. Then Martha stepped forward, positioning herself between Sarah and Eleanor. I think you should go, Sarah. You've said your piece. Now let the rest of us say ours. Sarah looked around, seemed to realize she'd overplayed her hand. She sniffed, gathered her skirts, and stalked away. Lucy followed, and a few others. But more stayed. More than Eleanor had dared hope. Emma Thornton spoke first. My mother was pregnant when my father died. She was terrified too, worried about how she'd manage, what people would say, but our community supported her. We brought food, helped with the farm, made sure she and I were cared for. She looked at Eleanor directly. That's what community means. Not judgment, support. I lost 3 children before I had one that lived, another woman said. Catherine Walsh, the baker's wife. 3 babies born too early, too small, too fragile, and people whispered that I was doing something wrong, that God was punishing me, but it wasn't punishment. It was just... She paused, struggling. Life. Hard and unpredictable and sometimes cruel. Eleanor lost her daughter to fever. That wasn't her fault. And this baby, this is a blessing, a second chance. One by one, other women spoke, sharing their own stories of loss, of judgment, of the particular cruelties that women faced in this frontier town. Eleanor listened, stunned as her isolation cracked open to reveal something underneath. Not universal acceptance, there were still plenty who judged her and would continue to judge her, but a core of understanding, a foundation of support she hadn't known existed. Martha turned to Eleanor, and in her arms was a bundle wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a quilt. Not the fancy quilts sold in the general store, but something else. A patchwork of different fabrics, different colors, each square clearly made by different hands. We started this a week ago, Martha said quietly. After I told a few of the women about your situation, each of us made a square for the baby, for you, to show that you're not alone. Eleanor took the quilt with shaking hands. Each square was unique, some carefully stitched, some rough and practical, but all made with care, with love. She traced the patterns, seeing in them the hands that made them, the women who'd suffered and survived, and were now offering her the same grace they'd needed. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Jacob's arm came around her, solid and warm. See, I told you, more people than you think. It wasn't everyone. It wasn't even most. But it was enough. Enough to build on, enough to give Eleanor hope that when the baby came, she wouldn't face it alone. That she and Jacob would have allies, friends, support. Pastor Yates approached, his expression softer than it had been. Eleanor, Mrs. Stone, I owe you an apology. I let my concern for propriety override my duty to provide pastoral care. You've faced tremendous loss, and instead of offering comfort, this community offered judgment. I'm sorry for that, and I promise you, when your child is born, I'll baptize it with joy and welcome it into our congregation as I would any child of God. Eleanor couldn't speak, could only nod while tears streamed down her face. Jacob shook the pastor's hand, his expression grave but grateful. The group began to disperse, but the warmth of their support lingered. Eleanor stood on the church steps with Jacob beside her and the community quilt in her arms, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt like she belonged. Spring came to Silver Ridge the way it always did, slowly, grudgingly, fighting winter for every inch of ground. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, revealing brown earth that would soon turn green. The creeks ran high with meltwater, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine and possibility. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the cabin, their cabin now, hers and Jacob's, and watched him work in the garden plot he'd expanded. He moved with the steady rhythm of a man who knew the value of patience, turning the soil, preparing it for planting. His sleeves were rolled up despite the lingering chill, and she could see the play of muscle beneath his skin, the strength that had sustained them both through the winter. She was 8 months pregnant now, round and ungainly and more beautiful than Jacob insisted she'd ever been. The baby moved constantly, turning and kicking and reminding her every moment that life continued, that hope persisted, that love could grow even in the hottest soil. The winter had been difficult, but not unbearable. Some in town still refused to acknowledge her, still whispered behind their hands when she and Jacob came to church or visited the general store. Sarah Miller crossed the street rather than pass them. Lucy Patterson made pointed comments about hasty marriages and questionable morality. But others, more than Eleanor had dared hope, had extended friendship. Martha visited weekly, bringing food and conversation and the kind of practical support that made survival possible. Emma Thornton had become a genuine friend, often stopping by to help with sewing or simply to talk. Catherine Walsh brought bread every Sunday after church, never asking for anything in return, and Pastor Yates, true to his word, had shown them respect and pastoral care. The community quilt lay folded in the cradle Jacob had finished in January, the cradle that sat ready beside their bed, waiting for its occupant. Eleanor had traced each square 100 times, memorizing the patterns, the stitches, the tangible proof that she wasn't alone. Jacob straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead, and saw her watching. His face transformed with that smile she'd come to love, the one that made him look younger, lighter, as though the weight he'd carried for 5 years had finally eased. "You should be resting," he called. "I've been resting all morning. I needed to see daylight." He crossed to her, his hands going automatically to her swollen belly. The baby kicked against his palm, and he laughed, actually laughed, bright and full of wonder. "Strong," he said. "Going to be a fighter, this one. Like its mother. Like both its mothers." Jacob's voice was soft. He knelt and spoke directly to Eleanor's belly, the way he did every evening. "Your Mama Sarah loved you before she ever met you. She's watching over you from heaven, making sure you grow strong and healthy. And your Mama Eleanor, she's the bravest person I know. You're lucky to have her." Eleanor's throat tightened. Jacob had taken to calling Sarah the baby's first mother, had woven her memory into their life so completely that Eleanor sometimes felt her daughter's presence like a blessing rather than an absence. He'd placed Sarah's baby shoes in the cradle, along with James's carved spoon, tangible connections to the past that would help this new child understand where it came from. On the mantel, James's pocket watch sat beside a photograph of Margaret, Jacob's late wife, that he'd brought from the mountains. Their lost loves didn't compete with their present love. They coexisted, honored and remembered, but not allowed to overshadow the life Eleanor and Jacob were building together. "Martha's coming for supper," Eleanor said. "She's bringing Jane and Emma. They want to make sure everything's ready for when the baby comes." "Everything's been ready for weeks. I've checked the supplies 12 times." "Check them again. It makes you feel useful." Jacob grinned and kissed her, tasting of earth and spring and promise. "I love you, Eleanor Stone." "I love you too." That evening, the cabin filled with women's voices and laughter. They inspected the cradle, admired the tiny clothes Eleanor had sewn, and shared stories of their own childbirths. Some frightening, some funny, all designed to prepare Eleanor for what was coming. Jacob retreated to the barn, giving them space, but Eleanor could see him through the window, working on something new. Another project, always another project. He couldn't seem to stop building, as though he were trying to construct a future solid enough to withstand any storm. The baby came 2 weeks later, on a morning when the world smelled like lilacs and new grass. Eleanor labored through the day with Martha and Jane attending her, with Jacob pacing outside until Martha finally ordered him in to hold his wife's hand and be useful. The pain was tremendous, worse than she remembered with Sarah, but Eleanor embraced it. Pain meant life. Pain meant her baby was fighting to be born. When the cry finally came, thin and indignant and absolutely perfect, Eleanor wept with relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude. Martha placed the baby in her arms, a boy with a shock of dark hair and James's blue eyes and lungs that worked beautifully. "He's perfect," Martha said, tears on her own face. "Absolutely perfect." Jacob stood frozen at the bedside, staring at the child in Eleanor's arms, as though he couldn't quite believe it was real. Eleanor reached for his hand, pulled him closer. "Your son," she said. "Thomas Jacob Stone." Thomas for Jacob's lost child. Jacob for the man who'd chosen to be this baby's father. Stone, the name that would protect him, claim him, make him legitimate in the eyes of the law and the community. Jacob's face crumpled. He sank to his knees beside the bed and pressed his forehead against Eleanor's shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. She held him with one arm while cradling Thomas with the other, this man and this child who were her whole world now. "Thank you," Jacob whispered against her skin. "Thank you for giving me this, for letting me be his father. Thank you for wanting to be." Later, after Martha and Jane had left, after the cabin had settled into the particular quiet that comes with a newborn's presence, Jacob held Thomas for the first time. He sat in the chair he'd built, the cradle at his feet, and looked at the baby with an expression of absolute wonder. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said softly. "I'll protect you and your mama with everything I have. I'll teach you to be strong and kind and honorable. I'll tell you about your birth father, James, who was a good man, and about your sister, Sarah, who would have loved you. And I'll make sure you know every single day that you're wanted and loved and valued." Thomas yawned, tiny and perfect, and Jacob laughed through his tears. Eleanor watched them from the bed, exhausted and elated, and more at peace than she'd been in 3 years. The road had been hard, the losses had been devastating, the judgment had been cruel. But somehow, impossibly, they'd made it through, had found each other in the wreckage and built something new. Outside, the mountains rose sharp and beautiful against the evening sky. Inside, a family, broken pieces fitted together into something whole, began their life together. And Eleanor thought of that night at the Christmas auction, of standing humiliated while no one bid, of Jacob stepping forward with $20 and a kind heart. Sometimes the loneliest moments led to the most beautiful beginnings. Sometimes loss opened the door to unexpected grace. And sometimes, just sometimes, broken people found each other and discovered they fit together perfectly, their jagged edges creating a bond stronger than anything whole could ever be. Eleanor closed her eyes and smiled. She was home. They all were. Finally, completely home.